G'day, Paul Jones here, back for our second study on Hosea. And if you haven't already, have a listen to the first one on enacted parables. So you've read Hosea 1 and hopefully considered what represents what in this enacted parable, like who represents what. And I wonder how you went with that. I'm guessing you noticed too, as you read through it and talked about it, that there are no props required in this particular enacted parable. There are no pots, no clay, no shaven beards, no iron horns. The prophet himself, Hosea, represents God in the parable. And the prostitute Gomer represents the people of Israel. And I'll have a bit more to say about that later. But it's more than that. The prophet's entire family becomes a parable to the onlooking nation, don't they? Everyone's watching. And we'll be looking at the names that Hosea gives to his 3 kids in study 3 in the next one. But let's put Hosea's sexual scandal in context, okay? And to do that, we need to take a step back. As you probably know, God established a covenant relationship with Israel in the Old Testament at Mount Sinai after they'd come out of Egypt. And you can read about that in Exodus 19. And what kind of relationship is that? Well, it's a covenant relationship. And what do we know about covenant relationships? It's a bit of an aside, but perhaps you can discuss that in your small groups. But in a nutshell, a covenant is a binding relationship between 2 parties or people. It's linear, it's a straight line, and it's exclusive. It's a partnership, much like a marriage. In fact, a marriage is a very good example of a covenant relationship. And to state the obvious, that's how a marriage relationship is designed to work. Right? The relationship has to be exclusive. No one else is allowed in. Anyone else gets into that relationship and it becomes chaos. It's a mess. Why? Because divided loyalty is no loyalty at all. And this is why Jesus says in the New Testament, no one can serve 2 masters, right? A slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and wealth. That's in Matthew 6:24. In Revelation, that vision of Jesus, he puts it even more strongly. He says, I know your works. You're neither hot nor cold, and I wish that you were either cold or hot. So because you're lukewarm and neither cold or hot, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. Now that's very strong language. The Greek is actually vomit. It's even stronger perhaps. Divided loyalty is no loyalty at all. And the prophets always use strong language. You've probably noticed that. To get their message across, they always use powerful language, and they consistently describe Israel as Yahweh's bride in the Old Testament, because it's the strongest way to express that God's ideal, God's hope, is for a really intimate relationship with his people. And so that's the language that's used by the prophets. You'll see it in Jeremiah 3, Isaiah 54, and especially here in Hosea 2. And of course that language, as you will know, it carries through to the New Testament, doesn't it? Where the church is described as the bride of Christ, the wife of Christ. It's a powerful term. And so we begin to see that the message communicated by Hosea's enacted parable is the sad truth that Israel is involved in a love triangle. The sad truth of the message of this book is that Israel is in a love triangle. Now, as we read the Old Testament, it's not just Hosea, it's right across the prophets, that this is Israel's biggest problem: divided loyalty. The Old Testament prophets call it idolatry. And many of them, including Hosea, also call it adultery, right? Idolatry is adultery. It's a powerful way of expressing what might seem impersonal. And it's the church's biggest problem today, but I'm guessing you already knew that too. Jesus wants the full allegiance of his church. He wants a faithful bride. But so often we, the church, the bride of Christ, we get involved in idolatrous or adulterous love triangles. Now let me just pause here for a second to acknowledge something. I can imagine that some female readers would find these biblical images or metaphors problematic. God is the faithful, loving man, and Israel is the cheating, promiscuous woman, even a prostitute. And for some Bible readers, this parable feels degrading to women, and we might ask whether a female prophet would have used the same language. Now that's hard to know, but what we can affirm is that prophets like Hosea and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they didn't use these images to deliberately offend women. Actually, they used them to deliberately offend everyone, right? And that's really important to note. Regardless of your gender and regardless of their gender, these prophets, in fact, Hosea explicitly blames men for the nation's problem in Hosea 4:14. The reason that there are women at these cultic shrines, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is because men are going to these shrines. We'll come back to that. But what we need to remember, as I mentioned last time, is that these texts and these events that we're talking about, they're thousands of years old. And even being God's inspired messengers doesn't mean that a prophet can, rise above their context, out of their patriarchal historical world, to use imagery that would not offend readers some 3,000 years later. You know what I mean? So some degree of culture clash is inevitable when we study the Bible, especially the Old Testament. And because we're drawing contemporary meaning from an ancient text, it doesn't always come easy. And I just want to acknowledge that. In any case, whether you are male or female reading this, you will understand that the main point that the prophets are trying to make is that a love triangle always leads to jealousy, it always leads to unrequited love, and it always leads to betrayal. And that's why God uses the language of jealousy so often in the Bible, right? For example, Exodus 34:14 says, "For you shall worship no other God, because the Lord, whose name is jealous," capital J, is a jealous God. Like, that's about as strong a way as you can put that. Now, that's not to say God has a negative characteristic, it's a negative character trait for God. It's that God loves his people, right? So much. And so, of course, it grieves God when we put other gods, other idols before him. Money, body image, pornography, jobs, your status on social media, your phone, your car, your house, your reputation, your ideas and achievements, even your family. The list is really long, and any of those things can become an idol. Love triangles are everywhere. And I wonder, perhaps even now, if you are beginning to ask whether you might be in one. But that's for you to talk about with your small group. I'll see you next time.